So when it comes to masking and plugs for blasting or powder coating, when you're trying to protect parts and surfaces of parts that you don't want to have a coating on or you don't want to be blasted, we've talked about masking in the past and taping and things like that. We touched on caps and plugs, but we didn't dive into them very deeply. And it's a big thing that we use on a regular basis. We at Kaiser, we might not use them as much as other facilities. We usually are just using stock off the shelf plugs or caps that we can order from suppliers. There are a lot of companies that use very customized masking. It's custom made specifically for the parts they're doing because it's very intricate type of masking, and instead of doing it all with tape, they get silicone plugs or EPDM plugs, or it's more of a plug cap altogether to protect a really big area. But the two main areas or materials used for caps and plugs that I see that I'm most familiar with is silicone and EPDM. When we first started powder coating, we were using EPDM. If I remember correctly, they usually are just a little bit cheaper than the silicone, at least from the supplier that we were dealing with at the time. And the EPDM is heat resistant, they work well, they hold up really well to blasting. They're a little bit harder rubber than what a silicone is typically. But the problem is they don't shed the coating off, the powder coating off as well after the coating has cured. A silicone plug, at least based on our experience, is a little bit more reusable. Each layer of powder coating doesn't stick very well to the plug, so you can kind of, when you go to reuse that plug, just by grabbing it, you kind of crumble the old coating off, and it's pretty much brand new or close to, where the EPDM seems to just get layers and layers and layers, and then you just have to throw them away. It pretty much sticks to it pretty well, doesn't peel off very easily. So we went away from the EPDM, even though they were usually cheaper, and we do pretty much exclusively silicone for caps and plugs now, just because the reusability seems to be quite a bit better on that. When we do liquid coating, we're using the same kind of thing, so we kind of lean towards silicone plugs. Blasting EPDM, I would say, is preferred because based on our experience, they hold up just a little bit better than what the silicone ones do. It seems like the silicone is a little bit softer, seems to break down easier when you're blasting it, where the EPDM is pretty stout. The one thing that you have to be aware of with the silicone is that you typically don't want to use them to plug parts before pre-treatment. Since it is a silicone-based product, certain pre-treatment chemicals can actually leach some of that silicone out of the plug or off of the plug if there's just residue and they're brand new, and kind of run that down your part. And then you might have some fisheye issues or adhesion issues just because you're getting silicone residue off of that new plug onto your part. So we're typically plugging and capping like threads and things after the fact, after we've pre-treated, and so you're just putting that in and then coating, so you're really not getting any kind of runoff of the plug onto the part. We do utilize plugs sometimes to protect water from getting inside of parts during pre-treatment, so I can't say 100% of the time that we're always plugging after pre-treatment. We haven't seen a huge issue that, like, if you go to silicone plugs, you really need to watch out for all kinds of things. It could really cause fisheye and adhesion issues, so I don't want to say that or scare people away from using them. You just have to be aware that it is a possibility, especially if you order like all new plugs. We did recently. We haven't ordered new plugs in quite some time. We just keep reusing them, and they're all kind of getting low because they get thrown away or lost, and then also they just, over time, they get built up on them. Even the silicone ones will get built up on them. So recently I just bought all new. We got to sort through them, get them in all the buckets so they're easily accessible. But with that, we probably will have a conversation at a team meeting to say, hey, these are brand new plugs. We need to be a little bit careful. There's going to be some silicone residue on them still. We could run into some issues if we're going to do a really large run where we're using a lot of plugs. We need to be thinking about that. A lot of the time when we're plugging and capping, it's kind of on onesie-twosie stuff. So if we have an issue, it's a bummer, but it's not the end of the world because it's not 1,000 pieces, it's one piece. So that's just something that you need to consider. There's quite a few different masking companies out there or suppliers that have caps and plugs, and there's more materials than what I'm mentioning, but typically that's kind of the two main ones that you see. There's all different kinds of sizes and orientations. We typically use, because we're trying to get a range of plugs that'll cover us for everything. Since we are a job shop, it's not like we're doing thousands of the same part every day. So we need a plug that can go pretty much for anything. So we usually use tapered plugs, and they're usually about an inch long. And so they start with and they're round, but they kind of look like a cone, essentially. They start with a small diameter at one end and with a bigger diameter at the other. They're about an inch long. So with that one tapered plug, you can plug a lot of different size of holes. Since it's tapered, the diameter's changing. And then we have multiple different sizes of those tapered plugs. We usually start somewhere around maybe like a 1/16 of an inch diameter is our smallest tapered plug at the smallest end, and our biggest tapered plug can get up to like 2 inches, right? So we have quite a few different plugs, probably 20 or so different tapered plugs. One thing that can be a cost saver if you have to do a lot of plugging of huge holes, which we tend to get into those situations because we're doing a lot of really large weldments, and so there's usually a lot of pretty large bearing surfaces where shafts or large bolts ride on those surfaces, and so we have to protect that so when they go to assemble they can actually get it to put together. And so we're using pretty large diameter plugs, like I said, up to 2 inches. Usually they make them bigger, but we're usually around 2 inches is about the max that we need. So you can have a full silicone plug, it's about 2 inches and about that thick, and it's still tapered, but it's just one chunk. It's pretty heavy, actually. There are some companies that make hollowed tapered plugs, so instead of having to pay for that big chunk of silicone, they have the outside profile is the shape that you need, but the inside, if you look at like the one side of it from one end, it's actually all hollowed out, so it doesn't take near as much silicone material to make that plug, so it drives the cost of that down. So most of our larger plugs, we go from just like a solid tapered silicone plug, and then when we get up into the probably anything bigger than like an inch or an 1.25 inch diameter, then we start going to the hollowed plugs. You have some choice on color, so a lot of the suppliers make each one of their plugs a different size color, or the similar sizes they make different colors, so it's very easy to differentiate between. Some suppliers have just all one color, all clear, or they look white but they're clear. We utilize both. I don't like having every single one of our plugs clear, because since we're trying to cover all sizes, we have plugs that are very similar, as the ones that are next to each other in the whole spectrum are really hard to tell the difference between when you're trying to sort quickly. If they're different colors, they're very easy to tell the difference between. So we like to keep as many different colored plugs as we can, especially if they're similar size. And so we tend to lean towards suppliers that allow us that have colored plugs. We also utilize the clear ones too, but when you have every single one of them be clear, it's very easy to get them mixed up, and we like to reuse our plugs. If we were throwing them away after one use, or you use the exact same plug, same size always, then the color doesn't really matter. But when we're trying to reuse and sort, color is important to us. And then I would say just being able to keep track have bins and buckets, have them labeled, have an example of what the size of plug is, like taped to that bin or bucket. That way you make sure that you don't just end up, the worst thing is to end up with one box, big box, with all different kinds of plugs in it. The idea of, in my mind, the idea of a plug is to help speed up the masking process, and so you don't want to have a mess and it takes forever to find the plug that you want. And caps are the same way. So everything that I just talked about with plugs, caps are the same. You can get EPDM, you can get silicone. One thing interesting to think about with caps is, usually a cap is going over a rod or a male thread. But don't forget that that cap, has an outside diameter, and that might actually work to plug a hole. If you don't have the right size of tapered plug or what have you, then you can actually use the outside. If the OD of the cap that you're using is the right size, you can use that to plug a hole. So don't forget about that. Like I said, there's a lot of different sizes of, or I don't want to say sizes, types of plugs, and just, I've been just talking about tapered, but there's a lot of different ones that will have, and I don't know the names of them because we don't use them very much, but they'll have some sort of profile, or they'll have multiple ribs on them. So basically, you put it in, and it can, like if you're trying to do a countersunk or a counter bore mask, it'll actually fill the hole itself, and then it'll protect where that countersink or counter bore is, so it masks multiple things at once. And we'll put some pictures, if you look at the rest of our content that we're putting out, we'll put some pictures of those and some links to some of the suppliers where you can get those at. Another one that they call is pole plugs, and that's a pretty common name across many suppliers. Usually it's instead of being a tapered plug, it's just a round plug, kind of a cylinder shape, but then it has kind of like a pull tab on it, so it's easier to get it into the hole and placed, because it has that long tail. So let's say you have a thick piece of steel and you're trying to put a plug in it, but it doesn't like to go through very well. If you have that smaller tail that's already through the hole, you can grab that and pull it tight, and then that plug kind of snaps into place. So that's pretty beneficial. Again, we don't use those because those just aren't quite versatile enough for us. You have to have pretty much every single size of those for it to be beneficial. So we lean more towards the tapered plugs. It's, for us, it's one of the smaller things that we use. It's one of the smaller expenses that we have. We don't use a lot of it. We might place a few orders a year for caps and plugs. Usually there could be special jobs that come in that's a new size of hole that needs to be masked that we don't have anything for, so then I'll order new. But most of the time we pretty much have what we need. We've done some custom masking before, not very much. That can get really expensive really quick, but it can be really beneficial if you have a very high volume and you're capping or plugging the exact same thing over and over, and there's really no other way to do it quickly than to get a custom mask. So that's options. But the main thing, I think, just for the everyday job shop, to know just the absolute basics. If you're just starting to powder coat, and like, how am I going to protect threads, internal and external, for like male or female, I would say Google search some masking suppliers. We're going to be doing some shout outs to some of the ones we use on our social media coming up later this week. But usually the two main ones you're probably going to see are EPDM and silicone, and then you really have all kinds of options. I only touched on a few. From our experience, if you're a job shop trying to have inventory of plugs that'll kind of cover you across the board, usually the tapered plugs work the best, and then when they get bigger, it's going to be a hollow taper plug. And the only reason for hollow, like I said before, at least as far as I'm concerned, there could be other reasons, but it's just to cut cost. So we could buy large plugs that are just solid, but I don't, because the hollow ones are cheaper. And don't forget about color. I think it's important for sorting and keeping track of your plugs.